threat researchers here at Blumira, and my position essentially is to map out all of the different puzzles that attackers present when they perpetuate an attack against a customer environment, and really getting down deep and understanding all the different paths that those attackers take, and then modeling that, and then mapping that behavior for our detections within the Blumira product. And that's pretty much my deal.
Great. Hey, so like help me understand, because I think even on my side, when you look at different cloud infrastructure vendors like AWS and Azure and Google, like the first thing everyone is I think assumes, and we all know it's true, is the second you move everything into the cloud, it's secure, right? And so like, yeah, curious to hear your takes just overall of how people should be thinking about that from a cloud perspective, and then what are some of the things they should be considering from a monitoring perspective that maybe are overlooked? Would be great to hear.
Bill's a threat detection master, so I'm gonna see. Bill, I'm curious about what you think too, because you know so much about a lot of these things.
So I think to Patrick's point, he's correct. A lot of people and a lot of organizations mistakenly think that going to the cloud somehow automatically adds security, but a lot of times it adds an additional layer of complexity, and that's one of the ways that we run into security problems, is when we start adding layers of complexity. That's when we kind of get into trouble. So really understanding what's going on inside your cloud environment is really important. And so, there's this concept of trying to build like for like, right? So we've got like the traditional on-premise kind of environment where, it's very perimeter focused, and, some organizations have that like nice soft interior that's not really hard, but, they're confident they're good because, we've got a good solid outside perimeter. Well, with the cloud, a lot of times that perimeter doesn't exist anymore. And so you have to rely on other kinds of controls, and you have to understand different kinds of attacks. And there's not always a one-for-one. So, the kinds of attacks that, legacy on-premise folks were studying and trying to protect against, you've got entirely different kinds of classes of attacks that apply to cloud environments. So it's a lot more complexity, and I realize I just rambled there for a little bit, but yeah, I guess that's how I would think about it. Is it's not automatically going to make you more secure. It's going to add a layer of complexity. It's going to offer other benefits too, like elasticity and being able to scale and giving you flexibility. But there are some downsides that you need to be aware of and you need to address.
Yeah, and one of the other things to go with what Bill's talking about is with those complexities, the thing about, say, going with, say, cloud versus going with your on-premise servers and things like that is, the idea of like scaling. If you have like on-premise servers in an office and they're in the office, and you decide that you want to scale up more infrastructure and something along those lines, there are a lot more steps that make it more tangible, where you're like, okay, so I'm going to go do my configurations and all this stuff. With solutions like AWS, Azure, if you're starting to add more solutions, then let's say that you have a misconfiguration when you're now like using these services that scale quickly, then the next thing you know, you might end up with a lot of misconfigurations. And then oftentimes those are the vulnerabilities that cause breaches to begin with, is just misconfigurations, because there's just so much. Cloud's there's just so much going on. And just like Bill said, the complexity becomes something that creates needle in a haystack scenarios, and that's always, well, that's a big danger.
Yeah, that's absolutely spot on. So, the cloud, we tend to think of the cloud as, infrastructure as code, right? That's sort of the end game when you're going to the cloud. So you can kind of think of sort of the attack landscape in similar terms, where, you can't just approach these things as just something that you can manually look through as a person, right? You need to use automation, you need to use statistics where applicable, and I don't want to get into too heavy buzzword usage, but there are reasonably good machine learning models that are built into a lot of these different cloud environments that are really helpful in helping you identify either misconfigurations or threats within those environments.
Yeah, misconfigurations. It's you can detect misconfigurations. You know, if you do have a lot going on and you're trying to make sure that everything gets set up the right way, you know, sometimes that's the first step toward security is learning how to find ways to target and identify and detect those misconfigurations. And then, you know, once you figure out good systems for that, well, then it makes sense to maybe start getting into other things. And, you know, I guess that's why we talk about maturity in cybersecurity. So that's
One thing I think like what you're referring to is I don't think it's actually them like people, you know, I think they think it's abstracted cloud. I think it's the same problems actually as on premise, right? Is like, yeah, they misconfigured their firewall or they didn't keep a host up to date, or things a firewall's not patched. I think the nice thing is like, yeah, the cloud infrastructure is going to patch itself quicker, faster, you know, as they're taking on some of that responsibility. So there is some inherent benefits from a security perspective, but that doesn't mean the hosts that are running on that infrastructure are getting patched, right? So I think you have a similar set of problems, but that scale aspect. And so, yeah, I mean, so often for me, it's things like RDP exposure or opening a server onto the internet that shouldn't be accessible, that maybe might be unpatched and could be exploited. But yeah, curious to hear on you know, in the real world, what types of things specifically you would see as common examples that are introducing this type of risk that should be monitored for.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think probably, and this is true for on-premise environments as well. Uh, but the provisioning process when access is granted to something, sometimes it's just easy in the short term to just, you know, make that a very wide swath of access that's granted, and you end up creating these roles or these groups or these policies that give way more access than you know the function needs to do what it needs to do. So we have this concept of least privilege, which is like only grant the thing that it exactly needs. And so that's whether you're on-prem or you're in the cloud, that's sort of one of these universal concepts that really translates. A lot of folks that get in trouble with the cloud have created policies that are just sort of like give access to everything, because, you know, it can be difficult sometimes to like scope this down and still make it work correctly. Unfortunately,
hey, or we can do that later.
Yeah, that's
right.
true.
That's what happens.
I actually like one of the patterns I see with this, and that we'll just do it later. Is number one, it gets forgotten to be done.
Always.
But I think a lot of incidents actually happen in initial deployments of technology, because like they're like, oh, I'm not going to enable two-factor yet, or I'm not going to enable these security controls because like we just need to get the migration done. And so essentially what they don't realize is like they're compromising their own security controls. And the logic is like, yeah, that's something we need to do, but we'll do it later. Is all too often a common practice.
And in an age where everyone's focused on like speed and agility and trying to get things out quickly, a lot of companies, like out of trying to do things that might otherwise improve other aspects of their business, they're like, let's go get it out, agile, fast, speed. And then the next thing they know, they've left, you know, they didn't do any of the other things that make sure that they're secure along the way. So then, you know, if you could have been developing with security along the way, you don't have to like someday later either deal with a breach or try to take some steps back and do the stuff that never got done. And it could be years later that you're like, oh, we still haven't done that. Like 2-3, I've been at companies where it's like there's something that 2 years later they're like, oh yeah, we still need to get around to that.
Oh yeah. And I mean, looking back at like historical breach data is a great source. You know, it's like, okay, you know, company A just went to a new payroll system, and the old system was archaic, and like an attacker really couldn't get to it because it was on-prem, and they'd have to get in the firewall. But now it's cloud-based. It's a SaaS solution, and you can't just roll something out like that with just usernames and passwords anymore, because anyone can get to it. And human people make mistakes. They reuse passwords. They use a password that ends up in a breach database, and attackers realize this, and they'll recycle that, and they'll run these breach database credential pairs against these SaaS solutions.
I've worked at companies where, like, back in the day, where people, their standard practice, like, if it doesn't work or the package that you installed doesn't work, just run it as admin, or just add an admin service account to it. It's just like,
yeah, just run everything as root.
Yeah. Oh no, that's so bad.
Yeah, that's
right. That's one of that's one of the 7 deadly sins, in my opinion. It's like, don't use that root account, please. Like,
yeah.
go to a pseudo equivalent, like provision your access the way you need to. But yeah, I mean, in these different cloud providers like AWS, like they specifically call out, like, don't do these things, use MFA, provision these policies in a way that you're not giving access to everything, because they know that all of the breaches they end up investigating, like, it comes down to some very basic cyber hygiene kind of things, where it's like, okay, do you have these just handful of basics in order?
Hey, like maybe. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nato.
Oh yeah, I was saying, it's almost like those pieces that you're talking about, Bill. Like, really, they should be kind of just made right up front, like part of the policy and part of the expectation for, like, when people are doing this, like, just do it as part of it. I think that makes a lot of sense. It would save a lot of pain for folks.
Yeah, and
I was just thinking that maybe some people just like to live on the edge.
Just roll the dice. We'll see how it goes.
Like
then you
skydiving,
get into these arguments of, like, we're too small. I don't.
Yeah.
Who's going to target us? And the question is, like, everyone, because there's no cost to target you versus someone else.
Yeah.
It's like, once the attack's automated, they can target as many people as they want.
And, like, a breach can be devastating for small businesses, because so I do a lot of stuff with, like, the small business arena, and especially like last year and stuff like that. And a breach for a small business can just mean the end. There's your business right there. You've been spending 3 years trying to build this business. You finally got to the point where you're about to scale, and boom, got hit by a breach. Done. Business is over.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. I on that note, I think, like, it's still the sentiment, because I'm working with prospective customers evaluating whether they're going to put controls in place a lot of times around detection, right? And so often, like, we see, actually, they'll detect things and see things, and they'll still be like, I'm not too worried about it. We don't have anything confidential, or we're not too worried. And then, unfortunately, like, yeah, you see what happens as a result of those decisions 6 months or 12 months later. And then they have to go through that pain of getting hit with a ransomware attack or some of these other things. And so I think the biggest thing is, like, the bar to entry has become so low that you have kids that maybe are in high school that don't go to school because of the COVID situation. It's like, hey, let me grab an exploit kit and do some recon using freely open tools that provide the information I need to know of who's wide open, and then I just go. And I think a lot of attacks, I wouldn't doubt, are just for fun, more than anything, unfortunately, or hobbyist, right? I think there is a reality of, like, there's malicious intent and then the extortion that's going on with, ransomware. But I think it's a real reality that, like, there's the curiosity factor as well. That plays into it with the COVID stay-at-home situation that we've had. So going a little bit further, it's like, on these platforms like AWS and Azure, what do people need to be doing, from a monitoring perspective? And what are all the types of, logs and other things to consider that they need to be looking at, or at least automating looking at, to detect risk and threats?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I can speak to that a little bit. So within any cloud environment, you have these three big buckets that break down into a control plane, a data plane, and then you have some sort of built-in security software that typically is actually very good if you use it. And so monitoring those three sources with a focus on actioning and making sure that you really understand the alerting that's coming out of those systems, whether it's, guard duty for AWS, or Defender and Security Center in Azure, and I don't remember what GCP has. I'm sure it has something though. And then using those other log sources from the control plane to understand, like, okay, well, what happened? What changes? What was recorded? Like, how is this different than it was yesterday? Is super important. And so, a product like Blumira can help by contextualizing and then adding, the attacks that we model on top of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's one of those things too, where if you start to define out pieces like this, then that's what allows you to effectively build a response plan. And that comes down to, like, what are some of the benefits of SIM and, like, what is SIM? So I guess we should talk about that a little bit, because SIM is one of those technologies that just a lot of folks don't necessarily even know what it is. First and foremost, for those who are listening who might not know what SIM stands for, it stands for Security Information and Event Management. And it's effectively kind of exactly what it sounds like. It's the security information. And, Bill's talking about all these things and, what is that? Why do we care? Because, that's security information, but then we have to have a way to do something with that security information or make it valuable. And so then that's where the event management piece comes in, where it's like, okay, so we have this information. Now, how do we manage it? So I guess the question that I would ask for you, Bill, like, how would you explain, SIM as a technology in terms of, what is SIM for a business who's trying to be more secure?
Yeah, absolutely. So SIM basically breaks down into two major components. So one, you've got a way to take different data streams and normalize them so that when you have certain fields that match, they fit into the same source. So, if you've got a firewall that has an IP address field and you've got, say, an AWS log that has an IP address field, having that normalized so that when you go digging in those logs, you can search across all of those logs via the same search, if that makes sense. So basically, like, normalizing that log data so it fits into standard fields, and then building alert logic that sits on top of that normalized data so that you have this sort of continuous integration where log data is coming in, being normalized, and then you have essentially like detections or alerts that are generated from that log data. And then as a person investigating that, going back into that SIM, now you've got this nice normalized data that you can go and look through to understand what happened and tell the story. So a SIM is a lot of things, but it truly is important to be able to detect what's going on. But then after something has happened, being able to tell the story of, okay, what actually happened, right? Because you can't build a detect for, the entire chain of what happened. Sometimes you have to dig a little bit. And that data has to be normalized.
And for, like, smaller and mid-sized companies who don't necessarily have large teams or a lot of time, what are some benefits for getting a managed SIM instead of just trying to just do it all on your own?
Yeah, absolutely. So building that process yourself, even if you buy your own SIM using a commercial off-the-shelf product, it's hugely time intensive. It takes lots of time to stand it up, monitor, maintain it, ensure that its database doesn't overflow or anything like that. And then a lot of work goes into building those detections and that detection logic and tuning them, right? Because as anyone who has sat in sort of a security monitoring role will tell you, false positives and alert floods are the devil, and they are they just make you not like life anymore. It's just not a good time. It's not fun at all. And you'll probably a good number of breaches can be attributed to just like poor detection tuning.
That
I
makes
think
sense.
on that, I think it's funny because on that note, even today I was with a customer, right? And they're like, I want to get notified every time someone makes like logs in and does something under a domain admin.
Like, are you
And
sure?
I was like, yeah, I'm like, first off, like, oh, this is really interesting. Let's go hop into the data to look like how often is that activity actually happening, right? And we pull a report based on like the event ID. It's something, it's four numbers. That's all I know. I could Google it. Sorry, that's so bad. Actually, I think they only had 5 domain admins. So we grabbed the 5 domain admins and put them in. And pretty quickly it's like, oh yeah, that's about 100 alerts you would get in over a 2 to 3 day period, right? And so like the question more or less is like, what are you going to do with that? And he's like, oh, I just want to audit all of it, right? And it's like, well, go look at a report to do that. Look at more meaningful things as far as like, hey, is certain behavior going on with that, right? Like, what's the intent you're trying to figure out? And so that, that's kind of the thing is it's like, well, yeah, we already had some detections, right, that allow new domain admins to get detected and other conditions around those. But yeah, it's often that like, unfortunately, it takes some time to understand and then also gain the expertise. And I think the security analyst role is one that's pretty important, that like you're actually more of a data scientist than you are, I would consider to be an IT person. And that's probably one of the biggest things I've realized, not coming from a background like Nato where I've worked in SIM forever, is like that's some of the aspects that like our team is so valuable on, and augmenting like and being able to have the data science conversation with people that have good intentions but end up coming to the conclusions of doing things that are actually going to make a sim useless.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say useless, but like only good for like historical things rather than prevention
yeah.
and detection.
There's a great book called The Cuckoo's Egg, which anyone who touches incident response stuff, this is like the first account that has ever been made of like a documented case of like an intrusion. So I recommend that book to anyone who's like getting into the field or really wants to understand it. But you are spot on about that those alerts when they're being designed, they need to be meaningful. So
Very
an
true.
auditing activity, that's a compliance requirement, and you definitely want to do that. And you can do that by generating scheduled reports. But you don't want the same people who are auditing that activity necessarily to be the ones that are going to be receiving and paying attention to like critical security alerts that you want to action right away.
And you both outlined some things that I think are pretty important because even when I was working in SIM just like years ago, one of the disconnects were that folks even working in the SIM space didn't understand that SIM is ultimately a data science at the end of the day, and in order to drive value, it's not much different from driving value for like data science for something else like a whether it's for marketing or whatever. It's you have to define a goal, and then you have to really like understand what is that goal, what are we trying to accomplish with that goal, because otherwise like data science is something that says, hey, if we have big data and too much of everything all the time, how can we make this giant pile of data, like how can we find something valuable out of it so that it's not literally just like a haystack, because the needle in the haystack scenario is real. So I guess so for Bill, for since you have a lot of experience with threat detection and a lot of knowledge around that, with Blumira being very focused on trying to help folks, what would you say are some things that like we're able to help folks out with that we really focus on that really makes a big difference for what we provide?
So I'd say first and foremost, one of the most important things that customers and clients and prospects can consider doing is try and focus on the basics first, right? Because if you don't have the basics in place, then you're building a foundation or you're building a house on sort of a shaky foundation. And the second is demand more from your security providers. If you have a noisy detection or something that doesn't make sense, then it is completely within your purview to work with that vendor. And if that's us, that's sort of what we pride ourselves on, is making anything that we're building detection wise actionable and understandable, right? Because if you don't understand what you're getting at the end of the day, and you don't know how to investigate it or do anything with it, then what value does it have to you? So those are two things that come to mind.
And that's really strong point, because also perceived value, if someone perceives no value, then that, for that matter, then there's no value, because value has to be something that's perceived. And so, in the context of like business, or even if you're going through an audit, that's actually very important. And so I guess when we're talking about like technologies like AWS versus securing an on-premise data center, I guess what are some like significant differences, or at least one major difference between on-prem and AWS and things like Azure?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I would probably describe the biggest difference is like a change of where that perimeter is. So, on-prem, you've sort of got that moat, you've got that firewall, you've got that outer perimeter. With cloud environments, you've got different concepts of the same things, but they don't always apply. So in AWS and in GCP, you have this concept of a virtual private cloud, or a VPC. And the way those are configured and the way those are used are not always one for one or the same. And the other major difference is, infrastructure as code, right? So, on-prem, you're not necessarily running a script to spin up a whole bunch of new virtual machines, where in the cloud, you probably are moving towards using infrastructure as code. So within code, you have this idea of cyclomatic complexity, right? And that is this idea that the more lines of code a program has, the more the more complex that code is, the more chance for something to go wrong is. So you really have to try and pay attention and try and simplify things as much as you can, and establish guardrails where that's possible. So if you're building things like an AWS environment where you don't want your administrators to put a virtual machine in a certain VPC, you can build policy that'll disallow that by default. Or say, someone spins up a public S3 bucket, you can build policy that will go back and either just not allow it to be created, or just automatically delete it if it is created and it's incorrect. So being proactive about policy choices is really important when you're in the cloud too.
That makes a lot of sense. And infrastructure as code, for those who aren't quite as familiar with infrastructure as code, it's a pretty interesting concept, because there's this idea on one end where some might think of it as like containers, if anyone knows what a container is. But really it means that infrastructure, whether it's like a physical server or a virtual machine or some other device, all of the general configurations that allow it to kind of operate with the right operating system, the right configurations, all those things, instead of having to go like manually set up a server, or manually go set up a virtual machine, or manually set up certain things, then you can take basically code and then write a script that then has configuration. So instead of going and manually setting something up, like with AWS, what folks might not realize that they're doing when they're using it is you're clicking on certain things, and then code is going and then executing those configurations on actual machines, and turning those on with code instead of your hands. And that can be done with on-prem too, but with cloud, infrastructure as code sort of takes a major front stage, I guess, for that matter.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
On that note too, right? That also, when people get access to your environment, gives them the ability to do things like spin up crypto miners, right?
That's right.
And collect all the Dogecoin. As part of the reality is like, it's not only that they're looking to steal your data or steal your money. which I'd say like is just another form of extortion, is crypto mining in these environments, which has become pretty common. It seems like there's probably more controls that have been put in place on the cloud side regarding that. It seems like
There's certainly more detections.
Yeah, but it still happens, right? Consistently with customers as far as some of their ending results.
Not the most exciting day to find out that there's been someone mining compute.
You have any good stories on it? Yeah, it sounds like you have some good stories, Nato.
Oh man, I have so many random stories. So like I don't know. I'll try not to go too long on stories, but like I've seen some crazy things. With SIM, you can detect so much because it's sort of like the macro of monitoring. And let's say that you're trying to even unite different types of monitoring. Maybe you use network monitoring and file integrity monitoring, and maybe use all these other different types of monitoring to meet different needs of your business. One of the things that companies will do, and I've done a lot of consulting. You'll go into an office with companies, and I won't call out what company this is, but even like I see this over and over again. Is like you start talking to them, and you're like, oh, here's how this monitoring works, and it looks like you actually have an SSH shell that you should investigate, just like running in your environment. And then, nothing happens. They're like, well, if nothing bad is happening, then it must not be a threat. Like that logic is real, but the reality is that I think that in some cases, companies might not realize like what attackers necessarily want, because they might not want your personal data. They might not want all they might barely care about your passwords and all that stuff. They might literally just want something like your compute and things like that, where you don't end up having like, say, critical files being impacted or important credit card information being stolen. Like those are the stories we hear about all the time. But the reality is there have been situations where someone's been like mining out of a company for like 4 years, just like mining compute to basically get crypto. Because the benefits of that, if you think about it, we have the concept of like a DDoS. If anyone's ever heard of like a DDoS, what a DDoS is it says that we can take over multiple machines and then use those machines as a means for an end. So in some cases, DDoSes come from like people just want to like have their hooks into a bunch of machines so that they can even just like either go attack other people, and all kinds of stuff where you might just be the source of attacks where they never even do attacks on you. Maybe your company doesn't have anything they care about beyond using your infrastructure. And people will use your infrastructure as free infrastructure if you're not watching to prevent these things from happening. And it can cause you to have like your AWS account get shut down and stuff like that. And if you've been using AWS for a really long time, and all of a sudden you find out that like you've been violating all of these things that like AWS doesn't allow because you haven't been doing your detections and things like that, and then all of a sudden you're like, what if you run your whole business out of AWS? Well, that's a devastating moment. So like things like that have happened.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's astonishing how much value can be extracted from something like just getting access to an AWS account without even touching the data, right? Whether it's either reselling access to that environment or like you said, just exploiting, say, an old Jira instance and adding a crypto miner to that, which I have personally come across. So it happens, and it's something that you can identify, and it's something that you can take action on and prevent too. So on one hand, we've got like the detect, investigate methodology, but on the other, you've got like security architecture and preventing bad things from happening from the get-go. So it's like sometimes detections are great in that like we can identify a weakness in the way someone has architected an environment, like Patrick was talking about, like just leaving ports open in a firewall, or maybe not having a deprovisioning process to remove firewall rules when something's decommissioned. Well, in the cloud environment, the same thing's true with, say, removing old DNS records, right? And so you see a parallel attack that applies more to cloud called DNS name hijacking, where all of a sudden, like, you have an attacker who will spin up a web page saying, we've taken over X person's website, or maybe that's called in your main web application, and that can actually give the attacker a foothold into your web environment somehow. So yeah, it's there's definitely a level of complexity for sure.
Wow.
It's pretty fascinating. I think too, I mean, the reality is people will start to worry about APTs or advanced threats, and it's like, yeah, the reality is they can't even catch the basic stuff. And the basic stuff is what actually hits most organizations, which is like the password spraying, the misconfigurations, the no two-factor, out-of-date hosts, exploits,
or not having logging on to begin with, and finding out from a third source that you have a problem, or a third-party source that you've been involved in, say, an incident or a data breach, and then not having the log data to go and investigate. Right, that's the worst.
Right. Yeah.
No, I had to go through my first one like that. It was about 10 years ago, and I'm in Metro Detroit, and it was a local hotel. And is comical because I kind of laugh, but like, I was working for a managed service provider, which mostly did IT. Security wasn't really a thing, which is the case for a lot of managed service providers, right? I think more are gearing towards the side of ramping up on the security side and taking it a lot more seriously. That's something we help from a partnership perspective with managed service providers. But yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, for literally months, people would come back to the hotel and be like, hey, my credit card was stolen. And this is one of the places. Have you heard anything that possibly there was credit card compromise? And this went on at the hotel for months. And finally, I think it was like 3 or 4 months, and finally the FBI showed up. And they're like, hey, what's going on here? Like, we've gotten so many complaints that we believe you're the central point. And they're like, yeah, I mean, consumers come in, but we didn't have any way to actually know if it was us. So we were like, no way, it can't be us. It's got to be someone else. And so I think there's that denial factor as well.
Totally.
And yeah, at the end of the day, it ended up being that, like, yes, someone got access to their network via a credential that was stolen. They've been sitting there for literally like 200 days, just sitting there sifting credit cards. The PCI environment wasn't encrypted, so like they literally were just like grabbing droves of it. And to be honest, they were categorized as a small business, so they didn't have to go through the PCI requirements that some of the
the full rock
more advanced thresholds have to be. So yeah, I look at that scenario and like, yeah, that was 10 years ago, but I think that's still a pretty common scenario.
I would say
that's not all that infrequent, right? And so I was gonna hop in and show a few examples of like detections we have, and feel free to hop in and add any commentary here of like some of the things we work, maybe a few minutes on that, and then we can kind of talk a little bit more, answer any questions people have on the chat, and wrap up. Does that sound good?
That sounds good.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. There's some detections we can't talk about though.
Speaking of the 7 years, the one thing I'll say is, I don't know if you guys heard about this one, is like all the stuff that ends up in the news, you get like Equifax, all these companies and stuff like that. But one that I don't see really come up very often is TJ Maxx. Someone was in TJ Maxx's environment for 7 years before anyone found out.
I had an old boss that was hired in to clean that up after that bad thing happened.
Oh no, so bad.
Very, very talented guy, but yeah, that was a mess. You're right.
It was a messy one.
I mean, more often than not, and I think I saw this was probably a Twitter comment or a LinkedIn comment, but it's like, yeah, over the next couple of years, you just have to assume pretty much all the data is on the internet.
It's such a pessimistic way to look at life, though. I mean, I don't want to just assume I'm lost. I know.
Yeah, I mean, from a privacy perspective, right? Especially if you're on social media, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of information out there.
There is.
And ways to correlate different information to learn as well. So hey, so just to show a few examples, I was gonna hop in here, but yeah, some of the things like domain administrator accounts being created, right? That's a good sign of a late stage, right? As far as an attack life cycle where someone's spinning up new domain admins to deploy ransomware.
Yep.
And something this simple is something from an audit perspective that can really help stop an attack before it actually gets to the point of deploying ransomware or gaining access to other systems, right? So how like, is it from your perspective, like this is pretty much like they got the keys to the kingdom at this point, right?
Yeah. So there are a number of like categorized, recognized threat actors that like this is one of the last stages before they start encrypting things. Is they're gonna add extra ways to get into the environment. So if you look at like the back reports for Fin6, which is a Ukrainian threat actor, and they just basically like go in, fish, push malware to whoever they can. Once they get their hooks in, they spread throughout the environment and then take that as far as they can. But one of the steps they'll do is they will add extra domain admin accounts. So really, when you're looking at domain administrators, you should be able to count them on one hand. If you can't, if you have more than one handful of domain admins, you probably have too many. But it shouldn't be a common occurrence for these domain admin accounts to be added. So this is a great detection because it's extremely rare, and it's an indication that like, hey, someone's just been granted God level access to everything you have.
Yep. And I think monitoring for that type of stuff across your environment, so like G Suite, Azure, Active Directory is important. Some other important things are things like Mimikatz and Cobalt Strike. And I think we comment, you detect those at a host level, right? But a lot of times people are using those techniques and tactics to get into systems they shouldn't be. And I think a little bit different category would be like PowerShell execution bypass in order to log into systems. Are things, there might be some normal behavior with that. But a lot of times you can quickly identify like, oh, there's an exception whitelist of some sort, so that you can continue to have high accuracy monitoring for these types of behaviors, right?
Yeah, for sure. I guess one of the things I would add is that typically when like someone's pushing Mimikatz or one of these command and control tools like Cobalt Strike, they're trying to hide everything they do. So looking at things like huge blobs of like encrypted text at the end of a PowerShell command, like we can build detections that catch that sort of thing. Now there are unfortunately some legitimate pieces of software that will like base 64 encode things, which is like a form of encoding that attackers also use. But by and large, it's a high fidelity detect, and it's really good at catching like this is initial, like someone got a foothold on a box, like we need to look at that right away.
And it's always important because the things that matter the most, one way I kind of think about something is how do you make sure that you're not just like wasting your time on monitoring more things than you ever need to monitor. Is if what you're looking at is something that can be actionable, it's potentially something valuable enough to monitor. And so, with folks who are new to SIM and trying to figure out like, well, where do I start or what should we be detecting and things like that. One of the reasons why what we focus on are actionable detections. So, you're finding things that actually you should probably address or actually should probably care about and do something about, so that you're not just wasting your time seeing things that you really just waste your time, because it's easy to waste time with data science.
It for sure is.
Yep. No, and I mean a lot of what we've seen is people just don't have the time to spend to get it right. And they end up failing. And a big part of what we do is essentially on the front end, automating getting people ingested and set up quickly. And so just want to throw it out there for anybody on here. It's like, if you want to try the product out, once you have a sensor up and running, you can send syslog to it, Windows logs via nxlog, and then you can do things like set up a honeypot, which would detect lateral movement, or integrate with your cloud infrastructure like Azure or Office 365, and kind of on and on. But that essentially gets everything ingested. So all the detection on the back end with Blumira starts to be able to surface real risks and threats to you and your organization. So that's as far as I was going to go into the product side. Just want to share that. But we have about 5 or 10 more minutes. If anybody has any questions, comments, we're open for that. And then, yeah, just curious, any last pieces of advice, Nato and Bill, as far as other best practices people should be considering, thinking about as it relates to cloud infrastructure and cloud monitoring?
And the biggest one I have to say is just like, don't get too complicated too fast. Like, there's not unlimited time in a day, and almost anything takes time. So like with things like this, it's like, get to value as soon as possible. Focus on what matters first, then kind of focus on other things, or however have you.
Yeah, I would just echo that. So it's, make sure you're getting the right data to detect the things that are going to be bad eventually, and demand more from your providers. If you're not getting alert information that's contextualized, or that you understand, or that they can explain to you, then you should ask for more.
Asking for help is always a good thing. You don't have to do everything alone. Actually, this is just something for especially like busy business owners, or people who are like executives and just doing a lot all the time. Different personalities, some folks are better at delegating and things like that. But with security, it's one of those things that's so complicated that it's definitely worth asking for help, instead of necessarily trying to figure out every little thing by yourself if you don't have to. So I mean, you can always reach out to us with questions, things like that too. So, security, it's a team effort. I mean, even here, it's just a team effort.
Hey, I think on one of that note, right, is like how even our product and service is designed, which is pretty unique, because like normally, it's customers, it's like, hey, let's get you into the service, right? And then they get in and they're like, oh, I want to try and do all this stuff myself, right? Yep. And it's like, oh no, actually, like, that's not how it works. You can actually just ping us. And so like, what's good is having that dialogue of whether you should do something or not. Like, we're intimately using the platform every day with all our customers, the security analyst team and the detection teams. And so like, yeah, logically it's like, well, hey, we can ask that question of why do you want to do it, and if you actually should. Because that's so often, it's not that the people on these other side of the fence using or implementing these tools don't understand what they're doing. It's that they don't have the time to spend intimately with products and services to actually figure out what the right thing to do is. And that's kind of like the benefit of that, is like our security team interacts with customers, and it's kind of a check in that regard of like, hey, actually, is that the right thing to do? And how can we help you from accomplishing this? Because so often people come to the wrong conclusions. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but like, I think it's the same thing of like, the conclusion I joke about of security products should be measured based on the number of alerts that they send, is sometimes the logic of like, oh, but I should be seeing more, because security tools normally kick off a lot of noise. And so, no, I think it's very valuable, the things you guys are saying, from how to approach incremental wins and get to the right value as far as the cloud infrastructure and cloud monitoring side. So sweet. Any other last thoughts?
Just because cloud is more of everything doesn't mean it has to be more of your time.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess that Patrick, you bring up an excellent point about, sort of the deep knowledge of, the teams that are supporting, building, and interacting with customers. And, that's we definitely do these things and operate in support roles, but we also have deep knowledge around all the different sort of endpoint controls and tools, whether they're Palo Alto firewalls or, Guard Duty or, Azure Security Services. So we end up acting like trusted advisors, helping customers identify and understand like what's going on, what they should do. So that's sort of maybe something we don't advertise too heavily, but it definitely ends up naturally happening because we're so integrated and open about working directly with customers.
That's a good point, Bill, because like one thing about our product is the way that it's designed, like we have a focus of actually doing things like for and with the customer. So even if someone is working on things and then they come into a point where they need a new need for their SIM or a new detection that they need, we're able to mature with whoever is working with us in whatever way they need as an individual as well, which is a little different from how other SIMs where maybe you just have to build it on your own, which is oftentimes the case, or pay someone like $500 an hour, one of the two. We don't follow either of those paths.
No, it's great. I think this is all good advice. Thanks everybody for hopping on and talking about cloud monitoring. If anybody's interested in talking more with us about cloud security, don't hesitate to go to blumira.com and hit the contact us page and get in touch. Or if you want to try the product, blumira.com, there's a trial link at the top of the page, and happy to help you as far as helping getting up and running and trying it. And thanks, Nato and Bill. Awesome job as far as like always working on cloud ingestion, detection, and helping our customers surface real risk and threats in their cloud infrastructure. And appreciate all the advice you have today. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
I'd end it with a little like skateboard session, but I hurt my foot some few days out from hopping on the board. So thanks everybody that joined. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your day, and look forward to talking with you more.